So, hello everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this conference on applied development economics in Lahore. And I apologize that I'm not able to be there in person, but I hope to be able to answer questions at the end of this talk. So let me share my slides um, before I start. Okay, so I hope you can see my slides. What I'd like to talk about today are legal interventions to address the issue of child marriage. And this interest comes from the fact that there are a large number of women around the world today who were married where they were minors, below the age of 18. The latest figures from the UNFPA provides a figure of around 650 million women. And this is a human rights issue because these women were married below the age at which they could provide informed consent. And it violates the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. And it's also, from a purely economic perspective, an issue of underinvestment in human capital, because underage marriage leads to early school dropout, and early childbirth, which leads to adverse effects for the next generation as well, on children's health and education. And there's a growing economics literature which documents these effects on schooling, early childbirth, infant mortality, children's health and education, as well as intimate partner violence. There is also growing literature which looks at the effects of various kinds of interventions that have been designed to tackle the issue of early marriage, such as livelihood skills training for adolescent girls and young women, educational support programs, conditional cash transfer programs, and these have been shown to reduce the incidence of child marriage to some extent. I would say between 4 and 6 percentage points is what we seem to get in the current literature. However, the primary policy instrument that is used by governments in developing countries remains legislation such as introducing minimum age of marriage laws and introducing punishments for underage marriages. And yet there is very little work which looks at the behavioral responses of these kinds of legal interventions. There are 2 studies which are mentioned on this slide, which are exceptions to this rule. The study by Bellis, Obrero, and Lombardi, which looks at the effect of raising the minimum age of marriage in Mexico, and that find that the legal reform actually had some unintended consequences by increasing the number of informal unions and leading to an increase in childbirth in informal unions. And there's also a study by Garcia Hombrados, which looks at the effect of raising the minimum age of marriage in Ethiopia and find that it actually led to a decrease in infant mortality. So given the relative lack of work in this area, I've been doing work on various kinds of legal interventions to tackle the problem of child marriage. And I'm going to talk about 3 such studies today. The first of these, which is listed on this slide, is complete and has just been published. I'm going to talk about this briefly to motivate the subsequent work. The 2 other projects that I'm going to talk about are currently in progress. The first of this, which is with Abu Shonchoy, I'm going to be able to talk about some findings based on inline and follow-up surveys. The next one with Niyaz Asadullah is one in which the intervention is currently in progress, but I'm going to talk about the intervention to motivate the direction in which my approach to this issue is currently going, and where I would like to take it in the future. All of these studies have been conducted in Bangladesh. So I'm going to start by giving you a brief overview of the Bangladesh context. This is a country in which the incidence of early marriage is very high. Nearly 2/3 of women still marry below the age of 18. And this is in spite of the fact that there is um, a law which sets a minimum age of marriage at 18 for women and 21 for men. The age of onset of puberty remains a strong determinant of the age of marriage. This has been shown by Field and Ambrose, and it also so we find there's a similar pattern in more recent work in Bangladesh. So first, this study with Amrit Amarapu, Niyaz Asadullah, and myself, which addresses the question whether a change in child marriage law can affect social attitudes towards the practice, as well as marriage timing in a setting of weak law enforcement. And we do this by providing information about a legal reform in Bangladesh, which was introduced in 2017. And there was a period between the passing of the legislation in Parliament and the implementation of this law, which happened in late 2018, when there was relatively little knowledge about the law, particularly in rural areas. And this is when we provided an information through a number of different videos about the law. This was conducted in June 2018. And this information was provided by showing participants a short fictional drama which referred to different aspects of child marriage law in Bangladesh. So to give you a bit more detail about the child marriage law in Bangladesh and the legal reform which took place. So until recently, the Child Marriage Restraint Act of 1929, which was introduced by the British Raj, was the main law determining marriage age in Bangladesh. We'd set a minimum age of marriage of 18 for women, but there was a relatively modest penalty for underage marriages. 1 month imprisonment or a fine of 1,000 taka for any adults who engaged in marriage or facilitated marriage for minor. And this law was replaced by the Child Marriage Restraint Act of 2017, which introduced much harsher punishments, 2 years in imprisonment, and a fine of 100,000 taka, which is 1,250 US dollars at that time, for any adult who marries an underage person. But this law also introduced an exception clause which made it not a punishable offense to marry a girl below the age of 18 in special circumstances if the court deemed that it was in the best interest of the child. And the law isn't very clear on what those special circumstances are. So to conduct this study, we started with a nationally representative survey of women, a survey which was conducted in 2014. And then we randomly selected 80 village clusters from this survey. And all the female respondents in these village clusters, plus 0, 1, or 2 additional respondents, were provided information about the new law in this intervention. And so, as I mentioned, the intervention involved showing participants a short video drama involving the marriage of a 15-year-old girl. The video was shown individually to different participants. There was a control group which saw a video which makes reference to just the 1929 law. And the treatment participants were shown videos which were nearly identical, except that it made reference to the 2017 law. In treatment one, the participants saw a version of the video which only made reference to the harsher punishments in the new law, whereas participants in treatments two um, saw a version of the video which made reference not only to the harsher punishments, but also to the exception clause. The intervention was randomized across two dimensions in terms of the video content along the lines that I just mentioned, and also whether the video was shown only to mothers of adolescent girls, or if they were also shown to the fathers and family elders. So this is an image which shows one of the study participants being shown the video according to the treatment or control arm that she was assigned to. And here are some images from the video itself, which essentially tells a story about an adolescent girl who who is about to be married, and then there is a legal intervention which then makes reference to some aspect of the child marriage law in Bangladesh. I'm going to talk briefly about the theoretical mechanisms that we test using this intervention. The paper goes into them in more detail. There is a widely known theory of the expressive effect of the law, which essentially is the idea that even if the law does not have strict enforcement, it can send information about a society's values. In this context, if the legal reform, since the legal reform introduced harsher penalties, it sends a signal that the society is much more opposed to underage marriages than what the study participants might otherwise have thought or might previously have thought. But then information about the exception clause might weaken the expressive effect aspect of this information intervention. And so if the expressive effect is at work, we would expect that the information intervention would lead to an increase in delayed marriages, but more so in treatment arm one, in which information was provided only about the harsher punishments, and then treatment arm two, in which the exception clause was also mentioned. And in the paper, we can compare this effect to that of the customary authority effect, which is based on some work that I've previously done, which is based on the idea that that marriage practices, well, in this context, marriage practices are influenced not just by the law, but also what village elders stipulate the marriage age should be. And these customer authorities can respond strategically to legal reforms. And there are certain scenarios where the strategic response could actually be to go in the opposite direction. So to be more supportive of early marriage and to be opposed to delayed marriages. And if this is what happens, then we can actually see a perverse effect and an increase in early marriages when the law introduces more severe punishments against early marriage. I'm going to jump directly to the results, the main results, so that we have sufficient time to talk about subsequent studies. So we look at marriage outcomes for adolescent girls 5 months and 10 months after the information intervention. And what we find is that, contrary to our expectations, there was actually an increase in marriages in treatment arm one. These are all girls who were 13 to 17-year-olds at baseline. So these are mostly marriages which are underage. And we find a 7 percentage point increase in marriages after 5 months, which is maintained after 10 months. This is relative to the control group. And we also see an increase in accepted marriage offers and a wide range of marriage-related steps. We see positive estimates for treatment arm 2 as well, but these are not statistically significant after 5 and 10 months. We also do this analysis using a hazard model in which we're able to include information for subsequent marriages as well from follow-up surveys. And when we do this, we find that treatment 2 actually increased the marriage hazard after the legal implementation, which occurred in November 2018. So it is as if that parents were waiting for the law to be implemented, and then there was a rush towards marrying off their adolescent girls. Whereas for treatment arm 1, we see a higher effect for the period between the intervention and the legal implementation compared to the post-implementation period. We also find that these intervention effects are absent in households in which only the mother of adolescent girls were provided the information through the treatment video, but they're large and statistically significant when the video is shown both to the mother and separately to the father or to some other family elder. We also look at effects on the attitudes which are expressed by the study participants who were shown the video. And we elicit their attitudes using vignettes in which they were shown a hypothetical scenario about an adolescent girl who wanted to delay her marriage. And then they were asked questions about whether they would support the daughter's decision if they were the parents, and whether they thought that others within the community would support the parents' decision. And the effects we obtained in these scenarios are consistent with the rush towards early marriage that we see in the actual outcomes, in the sense that there is a decrease in support for daughters who want to delay their marriage, and they also think that parents who support their daughters' desire to delay their marriage would not receive approval from others within their communities. And so what these results show is that there is very little evidence in support of the expressive effect of legal reforms, because the effects we observe are contrary to what the expressive effect would predict. The hazard model estimate suggests that parents were rushing to marry off their daughters before an anticipated strengthening of legal enforcement. And the evidence that we find also seems consistent with the customer authority effect, which is that family elders may have reverted to a more traditional position, supportive of early marriages, because of a perception that the law had perhaps become too distant from their own preferences. And so what we find is that providing information about the law, about a legal reform which introduces harsher punishments, does not really have the desired consequences. And this provided motivation for the next study that I'm going to talk about, because this study is focused on how enforcement of the law can be improved, specifically enforcement at the local level. And we explore doing this in two ways. One is by improving birth records for adolescent girls. And these records can be used to verify whether the legal minimum age has been attained. And we also provide information about helplines, which can be used to report underage marriages. And we explore whether these interventions lead to positive outcomes in terms of schooling and marriages for adolescent girls. And we also explore what are the mechanisms underlying these observed changes. So to give a bit more background, um, by law, um, births need to be registered within 45 days of birth in Bangladesh, and delayed registration involves a penalty in terms of a fee. And a birth certificate is required for school enrollment, for registering marriages, and for accessing a variety of other government services. But compliance with the law has always been low for children under 5. What happens is that registration takes place and certificates are produced typically around the time that a child enrolls in school. Uh, in our study sample, about 80% of girls aged 13 to 17 actually have a birth certificate, but only half of these certificates pass a validity check that we conducted at baseline, which means that only half of these certificates actually have a record in the National Birth Registration Database. And that could be because these certificates are fake or because the registration was not done properly. And we also find that the birth certificate requirement for enrollment in schools is not strictly enforced in our study area schools. And then turning to helplines, there was a national helpline center that was launched by the government of Bangladesh in 2012, which was supposed to be used for reporting gender-based violence, which can be used for reporting gender-based violence as well as underage marriages. This is a service which is operated by the Ministry of Women and Children's Affairs, and it provides psychological counseling, legal advice, information on government services, as well as police assistance if that is required. There really hasn't been any research on the effectiveness of these helplines, but the government reports that there were about 7,300 marriages which were prevented between 2018 and 2020 as a result of calls to the National Emergency Helpline. In our study, we find that there is a big knowledge gap regarding helplines, with only 2% of adult respondents and 19% of adolescent girls who could correctly mention the helpline. The figure for the adults are from the baseline, and the figure for the adolescent girls are from the control end line. So we do a two-pronged intervention. We conduct a campaign to improve awareness about birth registration. We also provide logistical support to create birth records or rectify birth records for adolescent girls in cases that they don't have a birth record or there's an issue with their birth certificate. Families were provided a financial compensation for the birth registration to cover the application fee and their transport costs. And in cases where families took up this option, a copy of the birth certificate was provided to the school authorities. And we also conducted a helpline awareness campaign, which involved circulating posters and stickers across the community, providing information about national helplines for reporting gender-based violence. And here you can see an image of one of the stickers that was circulated during the intervention. So to give you a sense of the mechanism that we have in mind for these interventions, for the birth record rectification campaign, the main mechanism is through the record of the school certificates which are deposited with the school administrators. Because if the school administrators have the birth certificate for the adolescent girls with their accurate birth date, then they can verify whether a girl has reached the age of marriage if a parent wants to take the child out of school, before the age of 18. And we anticipate that this would lead to a reduction in school dropout, an improvement in attendance in schools, as well as a decrease in early marriage. Similarly, for the helpline awareness campaign, we hypothesize that this will increase awareness within the communities of the scope of reporting underage marriages to the relevant authorities. And this information would improve the bargaining power of adolescent girls vis-a-vis their parents, vis-a-vis family elders. And this increased bargaining power could lead to a reduction in school dropout, improved attendance, and a reduction in early marriage. So the intervention was randomized across 240 communities. There were 3 treatment arms. In the first treatment arm, there was financial support for registering birth records, and there was information provided about how to register and obtain birth certificates. In the second treatment arm, there was information provided about national helpline. In the third treatment arm, these 2 interventions were combined, and then there was a control arm with no intervention. The intervention was conducted across 240 communities in 1 district in Bangladesh, which has a high incidence of early marriage. There was an initial listing which produced a list of about 2,500 households with unmarried girls aged 13 to 17. And all of these unmarried girls were targeted with intervention if they were living in the treatment communities. So just to give you a sense of the timeline, the household listing was conducted in late 2019. There was a baseline survey in early 2020. The helpline campaign was conducted in late 2020, and the birth registration in late 2020 and early 2021. There was an inline survey 6 months after the intervention ended, and there was a follow-up survey in 2023. And we are currently in the process of doing another follow-up this year. And what I'm going to be able to present today are the results from the inline survey and the first follow-up in 2023. And what I'm going to show you are intention to treat effects based on standard ANCOVA equations, as shown on this slide. And I'm going to show you results for intermediate outcomes, knowledge of adolescent girls about birth registration, and helplines, as well as knowledge of adult household members, and then final outcomes in terms of the schooling of adolescent girls and marriage of adolescent girls. And I'm also going to show you some effects to shed light on potential mechanisms that we see. So here are the results for the knowledge and behavior of adolescent girls. So in the first column, we see the effects on whether they've heard about birth registration. And we see an effect of about 4 percentage points in the relevant treatment arms increase. And the control mean is actually quite high. And what this effect means is that there is nearly universal knowledge about birth registration in the treatment arms by endline. We also see an effect on whether birth registration for these girls had been done in the previous 12 months, between 10 and 18 percentage points in the relevant treatment arms. We also asked them specifically about whether they had received NGO support for doing these birth registrations, and we see effects of about 16 to 22 percentage points in the relevant treatment arms. And then turning to the helpline-related information, we find that there is a very sharp increase in knowledge about the helpline by about 80 percentage points in the arms in which information was provided about the helpline. There's also a spillover effect on the arm in which there was just a birth registration campaign of about 8 percentage points. We find that the girls had actually called the helpline about 5 or 6 percentage compared to the control mean, where there were effectively no controls, effectively no control calls made to the helpline. And we also find that the girls know of someone who has called the helpline. There's an increase of about 1/3 to 1/2 in the relevant treatment arms, and compared to a control mean of about 8 or 9 percentage points. We see very similar patterns for these outcomes when we look at adult household members. So I'm going to skip over this table, but the effects are very similar. And then turning to the schooling of adolescent girls, we find an effect of an increase in enrollment in the birth registration and birth registration plus helpline arms of about 3 percentage points. We see this effect at N-line, and we also see it at the time of the follow-up survey in 2023, although the result is not statistically significant in all cases. And we also see some effect on attendance and N-line. But again, there seems to be some issue with statistical power here. But the point estimates go in the right direction. When we look at the marriage of adolescent girls, although we find that there are small point estimates which typically go in the right direction, none of these effects are statistically significant. So there are very limited effects on marriage timing from these interventions. Turning to mechanisms, we asked questions about the adolescent girls' decision-making autonomy, about decisions relating to work, about the choice of employment, about whom to marry. And although the point estimates have the right sign, they're typically very small and not statistically significant. So we don't see any improvement in the girls' bargaining power from any of these interventions. We look at school dropout for specific reasons. So whether there was school dropout due to marriage or due to poverty. These were questions which were that they were asked about at N-line. And we see effects on marriage-related dropout which are consistent with our findings. So we see effects which suggests that there was a decrease in marriage dropout. The effects are not very large for the full sample, but when we look at heterogeneous effects based on whether the household had expressed a preference for early marriage, we see larger effects for households in which the had expressed a preference for early marriage. Whereas we don't see any effects on poverty-related dropouts, which makes us think that the reduction in marriage-related dropout from schools, possibly with the help of assistance from school administrators, may have been a potential mechanism. We also look at whether there was a shift in attitudes towards gender-related norms. And these were based on questions that were asked of the household head. Questions about whether they thought it was appropriate for a girl to marry below the age of 18, whether the girl should prioritize doing household chores over going to school, whether schooling is more important for boys than for girls. And for all of these different questions, we don't see any shift in responses based on these interventions. And so we can rule out the possibility that the effects that we do see is happening because of a change in attitudes towards traditional gender norms. And so to summarize these results, we see that the birth record rectification campaign led to an increase in school enrollment by about 3 to 4 percentage points, and in school attendance by about 5 percentage points. But the helpline information campaign did not have any effect along these dimensions. And we also don't see any significant reduction in child marriage on average, but we do find positive point estimates for families with a stated preference for underage marriage, which I didn't show you in the slides, but we have those effects in the paper. And so this evidence suggests that there is some scope of improving delayed marriage and reducing school dropout through community surveillance. But helpline awareness campaigns on their own does not appear to be an effective tool. And so moving on to the third study, this is a study which focuses on paralegal training at the grassroots level to improve the effectiveness of child marriage law. And I'm going to talk in a few slides about what this paralegal training entailed. Specifically, what we're interested in is whether paralegal training increases the use of government and NGO support services by adolescent girls who are under pressure to marry early, and does it lead to improved outcomes in terms of education, marriage age, and aspirations. And the reason that we're interested in these kinds of interventions is because we see that providing information about the law itself does not seem to be very, very effective, and the helpline campaign itself does not seem to be doing much on its own. So this is about increasing the presence of agents at the local level that can improve the access to support services related to the child marriage law. And this is a diagram which illustrates how this intervention is supposed to work. So there is a legal aid NGO which is providing training to paralegals who work within communities. And the training is about child marriage law, on support services, on mediation in cases where an adolescent is at risk. The paralegals in turn provide mentoring to community youth groups. These community youth groups engage in awareness activities within their communities directed at adolescents who are at risk of early marriage. And these linkages, in theory, would allow the adolescents who are at risk to request assistance from the community youth groups that they're in touch with. And these youth groups, in turn, can report to the community paralegals who are connected to the legal aid NGO, as well as to government services such as gender-based violence helplines, but other support services as well. The legal aid NGO can engage in litigation as a last recourse because they have the legal expertise for doing so. But we anticipate that most of these cases of an adolescent being at risk of child marriage can be dealt with through mediation by the community paralegals and the community youth groups. And this project is being implemented in 50 urban neighborhoods in Bangladesh, which were randomly selected from the initial list of 100. So there are 50 treatment neighborhoods and 50 control neighborhoods. There was a baseline census and survey which was conducted in late 2023. And then there were 25 paralegals who were trained by the legal aid NGO to develop their expertise on marriage laws, on support services and mediation techniques. And this is an image which shows the paralegals doing a role play session on mediation in a child marriage case. And following this paralegal training, youth groups were set up in early 2024, and each of these paralegals supervise, so the slide should say 2 youth groups over a period of 2 years. The paralegals are staff who are paid by the legal aid NGO, whereas the youth groups are composed of volunteers who are aged between 16 and 25 and who live within these communities. And there's the inline survey, which is scheduled in the middle of next year, when we will be able to assess the effectiveness of this intervention in terms of improving access to government support services, as well as the effects on marriage and educational outcomes. So to summarize, the motivation for the studies that I talked about today is that legal reforms remain the primary instrument that are used by governments in developing countries to tackle the issue of female early marriage. And there's a lot of legislation which has recently been implemented along these lines, or are currently being debated in various parliaments. And yet we know relatively little about the behavioral responses to these legal interventions. The available literature suggests that there are mixed effects from legal reforms. And the first study that I mentioned today, it also shows that providing information on its own does not lead to improved legal compliance. Rather, it leads to the opposite in some cases. And I've also talked about ongoing studies which show that there is some scope of low-cost interventions that strengthen legal enforcement at the local level and improve compliance with child marriage laws. And we are finding that mobilizing youths within communities to improve access to legal aid seems to be a viable strategy. But of course, it's too early to tell whether it actually leads to the desired effects on our final outcomes. So I'm going to stop there. And of course, I'm happy to take questions about these studies. So thank you very much.